I'm Betsy Cannon-Smith, class of '84, and I'm delighted to introduce William Taubman, the Bertrand Snell Professor of Political Science Emeritus. Professor Taubman is celebrating 50 years at Amherst College this fall. 1967 he arrived. Congratulations. And among us tonight are many who've studied with the Taubmans, both folks in this room, of course, and on watching live. With combined degrees from Harvard, Yale, and Columbia, the professors Taubman, Bill, and his wife Jane, who's in the audience, and is a professor of Russian, arrived at Amherst in 1967. A historical perspective on political science, a passion for and deep knowledge of the former Soviet Union, and an exploration of the impact of leaders and their personalities has figured prominently in the work of Professor Taubman. He's a model for the value of and commitment to interdisciplinary work. He's reached across disciplines to colleagues in history, Russian, psychology, American studies, and more, to co-teach classes such as war, poverty, personality and political leadership, Russian politics, and rethinking the Cold War. Today, too, is a special day. May 24th, the first day of reunion, is also the day, 13 years ago, that Professor Taubman received his Pulitzer Prize for Khrushchev, the Man in His Era, in a celebration at Columbia University, one of his alma maters. And I see a copy there waiting to be signed, Bill, from one of our attendees. I know this as I consulted the historical record of a reliable local news source in Amherst. In an April 2004 edition of the Neighborhood News, the headline read, "Special Edition, Neighbor Scoops Grand Prize. William Taubman wins Pulitzer Prize." In addition, with one feature and one alone, an interview with the professor. The young reporters, then 9 and 11, had an exclusive interview right around the corner at the Taubman's home on Woodside Avenue in their living room with, and I quote, Mr. Taubman in the ruby chair and Mrs. Taubman in the sapphire chair. The trick, it seems, to garnering the Pulitzer and 3 other major awards was to work for 20 years on a topic you loved. Professor Taubman, on why he wrote the book, told the reporters, "Khrushchev is an interesting man, and I love Russia, and he was a leader of Russia. Also, he was complicated, a mystery, and he was funny." And in fun facts, as to whether he'd ever met, the professor shared that he'd seen Khrushchev in a car in Central Park once when he was in college. Professor Taubman's study of Gorbachev has occupied the year since 2004, and like Khrushchev, I trust he might say he too was complicated, a mystery, and more. Professor Taubman's next book, Gorbachev, His Life and Times, will be published by W.W. Norton in September and featured on Amherst Reads. With the frame of history and biographies of 2 major Soviet leaders as a backdrop, I think we are in for a real treat tonight with the perspective of a scholar whose life's work has been understanding the influence of personality on leadership. Please welcome my friend, neighbor, and the very fine William Taubman on Trump and Putin in historical perspective, how we got into the new Cold War. Welcome.
I should immediately tell you that those reporters who interviewed me in our house were Betsy's 3 kids. There was a very funny line in there, which if I'd known you were going to quote it, Betsy, where are you? I would have brought it with me, but I didn't. Now, if I can figure out where to put my books, under there, okay. Well, I'm delighted to be here, to be with you, old friends, some of you, new friends, talking about my favorite subject, Russia and the United States. Originally, I had thought to take a somewhat different approach. Given what appeared to be a kind of mutual admiration society between Trump and Putin in recent months before the election, I, like a lot of other people, anticipated an early summit. And in fact, when the London Times reported, based on a rumor it turns out, that the two would meet in Reykjavik not long after the inauguration of Trump, I was particularly fascinated because in my Gorbachev book, I wrote about Reagan and Gorbachev meeting in Reykjavik. So I thought it would be sort of like old home week. Another reason I was interested in this meeting that never has taken place, but who knows, was that I could imagine that Trump, the deal maker, and Putin would try to make a deal. And at the very end of this talk, I'll get back to that and perhaps even begin to sketch out what such a deal might be, because I think, frankly, that it wouldn't have been, depending upon the deal, a bad idea, given the state of Russian-American relations. Anyway, in my talk, I had originally planned to go back and look at Russian or Soviet-American summits over the last 75 years. Roosevelt and Stalin, Khrushchev and Kennedy, Gorbachev with Reagan and Bush, etc., to try to pull out patterns which we might look for or look to be absent in a Trump and Putin summit. But given the Russian hacking of our 2016 election and the tumult in American politics as a result, it seems to me that if there's a summit, it will take its time in happening, and it's kind of unlikely that there'll be any kind of deal, although we may be surprised. And so I put that aside and decided to talk instead about how the U.S. and Russia got into a new Cold War, which I believe we are in. And here's how I'd like to go about this. I'd like to start by citing 4 episodes in the evolution of that new Cold War from 1989 to the present, from the end of the old Cold War to the beginning of a new one. Then I'd like to try to define what I mean by Cold War, or at least what the classic old Cold War consisted of, and ask the question of how the new Cold War, if that's what it is, differs from the old Cold War. Then thirdly, I'd like to identify 3 features, main features of the new Cold War. And finally, I'd like to take an excursion through the stages through which we've arrived at this new Cold War, beginning with Gorbachev, Reagan, and Bush, and leading up to Putin and Trump. So first of all, those episodes. The first one I think you probably all remember. Visualize the Kremlin on a bright sunny day, June 1st, 1988. Gorbachev and Reagan are strolling in the Kremlin sunshine. A journalist approaches and asks Reagan, "Do you still consider this an evil empire?" Which, of course, he had said the Soviet Union was. And Reagan says, "No, that was another time, another era." That's how far they had come at that point, the arch-conservative Reagan and the Soviet leader. The second episode is December 2nd, 1989. This time the scene is Malta, and it's raining. It's storming outside, but Gorbachev is meeting on a ship in the harbor with President George H.W. Bush. And the conversation is so warm between them that it prompts Gorbachev's foreign policy assistant, Anatoly Chernyaev, who alas recently died at the age of 95. Jane and I got to know him very well as we worked on Gorbachev. It prompted Chernyaev to write the following in his diary. "I was astonished at how sincerely Bush and Baker wanted things to work out for us," meaning the Soviet Union, "how they wanted our economy to take off and for us to cope with our own troubles. If you closed your eyes," Chernyaev wrote, "and blocked out the English, you might have thought you were attending a Politburo meeting in the Kremlin where everyone was worried about our country's fate." So again, these 2 moments at the end of the old Cold War in which it looked, and it looked for longer than those moments, as if the world was entering a new era. Now, fast forward, as the cliche goes, to December 3rd, 2014. And this is Vladimir Putin speaking to the Russian parliament on what he takes to have been the American attempt to break up Russia, as I think he would have said, although I've not asked him about this, and he hasn't said so specifically, I think, as he thought the U.S. had tried to break up the Soviet Union before it. So he says, despite our unprecedented openness, that is, in Russia, back then, and our willingness to cooperate in all, even the most sensitive issues with the United States, despite the fact that we considered our former adversaries, the United States, as close friends and even allies, the support for separatism in Russia from across the pond, namely in the United States, including information, political and financial support, and support provided by the special services, that is the CIA, all that was obvious and left no doubt that they would gladly let Russia follow the Yugoslav scenario of disintegration and dismemberment, with all the tragic fallout for the people of Russia. It didn't work. We didn't allow that to happen, just as it did not work for Hitler. Now, in Russian parlance, to compare the United States to Hitler in its effort to break up and dismember the Soviet Russia is to put it fiercely. That's about as strongly as it can be put for a Russian audience. Now, my fourth moment here involves 2014 again, but this time Gorbachev himself, saying in various interviews that back in the 1990, he and other world leaders had talked of creating a new world order that would be more just, humane, and secure than its predecessor, but he continued, the Americans continued to play the old game so as to create a, quote, new empire headed by themselves, unquote. They, quote, patted us on the shoulder. They kept saying, well done, you're doing the right thing. But all the while they were tearing us down, looting us, tearing us apart. So this is Gorbachev in 2014, joining with Putin in saying essentially the same thing. We had a guest, Jane and I did last weekend, a young, or not quite so young anymore, Russian historian now living in the United States, and she said that these words had been put into Gorbachev's mouth, that this is not really him talking. But he's been saying this kind of things ever since 2007, and he's even said it to us, to Jane and me, sitting across the table from him in Moscow. Okay, what then is a Cold War, or what was the Cold War at its worst? And then I'll ask how the new Cold War differs. Several features as defined by a colleague of mine who used to teach at Columbia, Robert Legvold. First, each side sees the other as entirely at fault. Second, each side sees the conflict as basically about ideologically sacrosanct purposes of each country rather than geopolitical interests that might be more readily negotiated and eased. Each side believes the Cold War can end only when the other side changes fundamentally or collapses. Fourth, both sides see any agreement between the two as only tactical and temporary. And five, the Cold War was global in scope. Now, as I say, this best fits the worst period of the old Cold War when Stalin was the Soviet leader in the late 40s and early 50s. I don't think it quite fits some of the later periods like the time when, for example, Nixon and Brezhnev worked out détente, although some of the enemies of détente thought it still applied, and hence they rejected détente and didn't take it seriously. But what about the new Cold War? How does it compare? Well, I can see certain ways in which it's safer and better. I can see other ways in which it's more dangerous. I think it's safer and better because it's no longer global. The main competition is in Europe and the Middle East. On Korea, we're actually pretty close to the Russians in our view. It's not in Vietnam. So it's not global the way it used to be. And in another sense, it's not nearly as ideological, or at least ideological in the sense of the old Marxist-Leninist ideology, which no longer carries much weight in Russia except for old hardline communists. True, Putin has been developing a new ideology, or rather redeveloping an even older ideology, which features things like nationalist patriotism, orthodox religion, and social conservatism. But I don't think it's quite as dangerous as the old one, which had as a primary axiom that the United States, or the capitalist West in general, was inevitably out to destroy communism, and there could never be lasting coexistence with the West. Well, how might the new Cold War be more dangerous? Well, there might be some people in this audience who have an opinion as to what I'm about to tell you as to whether it could be true. I heard this fourth or fifth hand from somebody who has connections in the American security establishment, so I can't vouch for this at all. But what he said was that in the new world of hacking, it may become possible, it may have already become possible, to hack the early warning systems of the United States and of Russia. That is, the warning systems that tell each side that missiles launched by the other are winging their way toward your side and will arrive in 15 minutes. And that then gives you 5 or 10 minutes to decide whether to press the button in response and thereby lift off the missiles that the incoming missiles would otherwise destroy if yours hadn't been launched. Now, if this is true, and I don't know whether it's true, this would be a terribly, terribly dangerous possibility. But as I say, I have no idea whether it's true. There's one more wrinkle, which makes it even more dangerous. Same source, which is to say, not necessarily reliable. But he told me that among the Russian technologists, the IT people, who are capable of this kind of thing, if it's possible at all, there are some of Muslim background who have disappeared, either perhaps kidnapped or co-opted by ISIS, which is working on this very scenario. What else might make the situation more dangerous? Well, I think it's the case, Jane and I have noticed this, that Russians these days are more anti-American than they used to be in Soviet times. In Soviet times, they often reacted to the repression coming down on their necks by idealizing the West, and the United States in particular, which the regime portrayed as their mortal enemy. And if the regime said we were their mortal enemy, then we must be a pretty good place. But these days, as a result of Putin's propaganda and what's been going on in the world, Russians seem to be more anti-American. They used to be, some of them, more anti-certain American leaders, but now you sense more anti-Americanism in general. Are Americans more anti-Russian? I don't know. And here again, you may have a better idea than I if you have talked with your fellow Americans about Russia as to whether you encounter this kind of anger. Okay, I said I'd mentioned 3 basic patterns of the new Cold War. One is that both sides, or this is my view of it, both sides are at fault. I could make the case, although far from every historian agrees with it, that when the old Cold War began, there was more fault on the Soviet side because it was led by Stalin with all of his paranoia. He killed millions of his own people. He could never bring himself as a person to trust the West, whereas some of the American leaders like Roosevelt and Truman for a while, whatever else they did trust Russia and did trust even Stalin. But this time I think it's quite clear, at least to me, that both sides are at fault. Second, it's interesting to see the way the balance of power between the two sides, or rather the imbalance of power, has aggravated and fueled the conflict. What do I mean by that? Well, in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia succeeded it, Russia was as weak as it had been in a long, long time. The United States was stronger than ever. It was the only superpower left in the world. Russia was not a superpower anymore. And given that imbalance of power, the United States, well, we could talk about this if we want to, was in some ways drunk with its own superiority and power. And that may explain some of the things that we did later that many people regret. On the other hand, Russia was so weak that it had to submit. And even in those years when Boris Yeltsin, who succeeded Gorbachev, was very angry with what the United States was doing, he eventually swallowed it because he felt no choice. Later, under Putin, Russia has been rebuilt. He's rebuilt the state, he's rebuilt the economy, he's rebuilt the military, and he's begun to throw Russia's weight around in the world in places like Ukraine and even in Syria. And it's not surprising that now we are alarmed by that change from an imbalance of power in our favor to something closer to a balance of power. The third general pattern which has been involved in these years has to do with what are called in diplomacy and diplomatic history spheres of influence. Once upon a time, the East European countries were Soviet satellites, and places like the Baltic states and Ukraine and Georgia were, as you know, constituent republics of the Soviet Union, parts of the Soviet Union. Taken together, this was the Soviet Union's external empire in Eastern Europe and internal empire within the Soviet Union itself. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia lost Eastern Europe. Soviet Union lost it before Russia did. And I do not think, from what I can tell, that Russia and Putin are trying to conquer it again. That would just be too difficult and dangerous for them as well as the rest of the world. But they do not like the idea of Eastern Europe's countries becoming members of NATO. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. As for the former Soviet republics, the Baltics, Ukraine, Georgia, and the others, so far they don't seem to want to reincorporate them, but they seem to want to dominate them, at least when it comes to things like whether or not Ukraine should even think of joining NATO itself. Now, naturally enough, the East Europeans and the former Soviet republics like the Ukraine are alarmed and fearful. They don't want to let Russia continue to dictate to them or start to dictate to them. Whereas, equally naturally enough, the West, the United States in particular, think that Eastern Europe and the former Soviet republics have a right to determine their own destiny, especially when, and this is not always the case, they are plausibly democracies in which what the leaders say reflects what the people want, the people who have elected them. This, however, puts us in a tricky position, because what shall we do? Shall we try to avoid antagonizing the Russians, who don't want us to push NATO, for example, expand it? If we do so, wouldn't we be betraying again some of the East Europeans who had been betrayed before by the West in 1938 or 1945 or 1948? This is a serious question, and I don't think there's an easy answer, although perhaps other people do. Okay, finally, the stages through which the new Cold War has evolved. I've already talked about how well Gorbachev got along with Reagan and Bush. But in retrospect, you can see that as early as 1990 and 1991, the seeds of a future conflict, even a Cold War, were planted. Let me try to explain. Gorbachev acquiesced in East Europe's breaking away in 1989 from communism. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania. Gorbachev acquiesced in 1990 in German reunification. Gorbachev acquiesced also in 1990 in reunified Germany's remaining or becoming a member of NATO. And when he did these three things, the West was shocked. I've talked to some of the people, including Secretary of State Baker. I corresponded with President Bush, H.W. Bush. I talked to one of the key people on the National Security Staff, Robert Blackwell, who said, we kept waiting for Gorbachev not to acquiesce. We kept waiting, for example, for him to say, the only condition under which you can have the reunification of Germany is if you agree that a reunified Germany may not be part of NATO. But it never happened. Now, the whole question of why Gorbachev did this is elaborated, or at least I attempt to answer it in this book. But one of the main components of that answer is that Gorbachev imagined a new world order and a new European order. He imagined what he often talked about and called a European common home of Europe. That was often dismissed as a kind of propaganda, but he really believed it. What he imagined was that East and West divisions in Europe would be gone, that NATO and the Warsaw Pact would first shift from being military alliances to political organizations and then dissolve, that a new European security architecture would replace them based on what was called the CSCE, the Conference of Security and Cooperation in Europe. And it sounded at the time, if you look at what Bush was saying and Baker was saying, as if we were open to this kind of outcome. There's even one famous moment, which has been quoted very often, in which on February 10th, 1990, Baker told Gorbachev that if he agreed to Germany's joining NATO, that NATO's military jurisdiction would not expand 1 inch to the east. Well, as I will recount in a minute, it's expanded hundreds and thousands of miles. Bush and the other Western leaders pocketed Gorbachev's acquiescence, kept NATO, and even started to expand it at that time in the sense that East Germany, which hadn't been part of NATO, was now part of Germany, which was in turn part of NATO. Let's turn next to the relationship between Clinton and Yeltsin. Clinton often referred to Yeltsin as, in a southern accent that I can't duplicate, as Ol Boris, O-L apostrophe Boris. Now, Yeltsin was a very difficult person. He was boisterous, he was boastful, he was super sensitive, and according to at least some sources, well, not according to some sources, we know he was a hard drinker. But some sources say that at least on one occasion, he was found outside the White House in Washington during one of his visits in his underwear, looking for a place to have a pizza. Yeltsin reminds me a little bit of Khrushchev, whose biography I wrote. But whereas Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, let himself be, in my view, intimidated by Khrushchev, especially at the Vienna summit of 1961, Clinton took Yeltsin in stride, rolling with the punches and laughing off Yeltsin's excesses, in which he recognized, I believe, parallels to his own gigantic appetites. But although they got along, substantively, the U.S. was doing things which irritated Yeltsin, and yet which he, as I said earlier, swallowed. Clinton talked big about giving a lot of money to help Russia build democracy and capitalism, but he gave a lot less money than he had talked about. Furthermore, the United States offered a lot of aid. It sent over economists and others to help Russians figure out how to create a stock market and run a market economy. Key to that advice was a great emphasis on privatization, although that was not the only part of the advice. And now Russians, or once that in the 90s turned sour, as it did, raging inflation, high unemployment, the Russians began to attribute that to the advice they got. Not just a consequence of that advice, but as the intention of advice to mess up their system. Not all of them did that, and furthermore, it's not an entirely fair accusation at all, because after all, it was the Russians who accepted the advice and implemented it. NATO expansion in the Clinton years. 1997, the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary all accepted into NATO. And here's how one of the great Russian experts of the United States in our history, George Kennan, responded to that process. I think it is the beginning, he wrote, of a new Cold War. There was no reason for that whatsoever. No one was threatening anybody else. Our differences in the Cold War were with the Soviet communist regime. And now we are turning our backs on the very people who mounted the greatest bloodless revolution in history to remove that Soviet regime. Of course there is going to be a bad reaction from Russia. And then the NATO expanders will say that we always told you that that is how the Russians are. But that is just wrong. What Kennan is in effect saying is that this was a self-fulfilling prophecy to warn of the Russians, to expand NATO to protect against the Russians, and as a result of the expansion, to create, or at least to aggravate, the Russian threat to us. Moreover, there was the Yugoslav War, which we remember all too well, in which the United States depicted, with great justification, Serbia, a Slavic cousin of Russia, as the main villain. You may remember that at one point in the battle over Kosovo, we actually went so far as to bomb Belgrade at great length and with serious results. As a result of this, a kind of Russian narrative began to build that the United States had destroyed the Soviet Union, or at least tried to, that it had kept Russia down, it had treated it like a defeated power. Now again, this narrative is not entirely true. Bush, number one, George H.W. Bush, in 1991 went to Kiev, and with the Soviet Union about to collapse, warned the Ukrainians, who were key to the collapse of the Soviet Union, not to push too far, telling them that a kind of virulent nationalism, which some of the Ukrainians were practicing, not all, but would be worse than a democratic Soviet Union of which Ukraine would remain a part. Another thing that the Soviet Union did was, post-Soviet Russia, they created many of their own excesses. They created their own oligarchs. They deepened their own inequality. They messed up their own democracy. Witness the fact that in 1993, challenged by a hardline parliament, Boris Yeltsin, in order to save democracy in Russia, bombarded the parliament, brought up the tanks, and tried to blow up the parliament. And one other thing that Russia didn't do over the years, which is very important, I think, this goes back to the issue of the spheres of influence. Russia hardly tried, or if it tried, it certainly didn't succeed in soothing the fears of the East Europeans or of the former Soviet republics. And so if the East Europeans and the former Soviet republics continue to fear Russia and seek Western protection, that at least is in part because the Russians didn't do a very good job of trying to make peace with their former neighbors and former republics. Now we get to Putin with Bush and Obama. In the beginning, Putin took over in 1999 as acting president and in 2000 as elected president. And in the beginning, according to his colleagues in the Russian government and according also to the NATO Secretary General, Lord George Robertson, Putin wanted to get along. This is what one of Putin's associates said. Putin believed relations with the West could and should be improved so that we could be partners. He considered that the problem was that they, the West, did not understand us or our difficulties that we were facing. We needed to explain our situation, discuss it with them, and they would help us, and it would lead to a different relationship. And here's what he told Lord Robertson. He said he believed, I'm quoting, that Russia should be part of Western Europe, that it was Russia's destiny to be so, that he wanted to work toward that even though not everyone agreed with him. The legacy of Kosovo was still there, but he thought it was a distraction. We would work together and cooperate, but of course that didn't happen. And here is Putin himself speaking about that time, saying he was prepared to discuss more profound integration with NATO, provided that Russia was regarded as an equal partner. Asked if he could ever join NATO, if Russia could ever join NATO, he replied, "I don't see why not. I would not rule out that possibility." Now, you may think Putin is a liar and was lying back then, but I'm not entirely convinced, at least back then. Because if you look at 9/11 and the world's reaction to it, you will recall that Putin was the first man to call President Bush, and that he offered anything we can do to help. We are with you, he said. And he offered access to Afghanistan, to American forces, overflying Russia and overflying the Central Asian republics where Russia still had such influence. Furthermore, there was very good personal chemistry between Bush and Putin. You may recall that Bush invited Putin to the Crawford Ranch. They had 20 summit meetings of various kinds. But meanwhile, NATO expansion. In 2002, NATO expanded to include Romania, Bulgaria, Slovenia, Slovakia, and the former Baltic republics. Furthermore, we don't need to talk about the Iraq War, or maybe we do, but the Russians didn't like the fact that we started it without their permission, that is, without the permission of the UN Security Council. Then there were what are known as the color revolutions in Ukraine and Georgia in 2004, in which the United States obviously favored the overthrow of regimes more friendly to Russia. By 2007, Putin was very angry, but the worst was yet to come, because in 2008, NATO promised eventually to make members of Ukraine and Georgia. Well, that hasn't happened, but you can imagine the Russian reaction. Putin was enraged, but from 2008 to 2012, he stepped aside and was replaced by Dmitry Medvedev, so as to observe the Russian Constitution, which barred more than 2 consecutive presidential terms. Medvedev responded positively to Obama's reset, probably too positively in Putin's view, because, for example, Medvedev abstained in the United Nations when the United Nations approved a resolution authorizing the use of force to create a no-fly zone in Libya. But we went beyond that, and together with our allies, we got rid of Gaddafi, which was not authorized by the resolution. Well, Putin returned in 2012 for his 3rd term, but not consecutive. By this point, he had been cracking down on civil society, on the free press. And in 2011 and 2012, there were demonstrations in Moscow involving tens of thousands of people protesting against the way Putin had rigged the election. Not entirely, but in part. And that seems to have scared him, convinced him that the color revolutions in Ukraine and Georgia could spread to Russia. And then in 2014, the color revolution returned, you remember, in Ukraine, where Putin's buddy, President Yanukovych, was ousted, and during those days in the Maidan in Kiev, the revolution there was cheered on by not only the German foreign minister, but by Americans like Senator McCain, who went there, and the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs in the State Department, Victoria Nuland, who was actually handing out bread and food to those engaging in the uprising. That brings us to the denouement, at least so far, which is very recent. Russia annexes the Crimea. Russia intervenes in East Ukraine to support the separatists. And Putin apparently no longer sees, if he ever did, Russia as eventually becoming part of the West. Rather, he has decided that Russia will lead or attempt to lead the anti-Western powers wherever they may be around the world. And so we have a new Cold War at the moment, although it's not total in the sense that we're still in agreement about limiting Iran's nuclear weapons. Anyway, this is the context. This is the background. This is the evolution leading up to Trump and Putin. Will Trump still try to ease this new Cold War? If he does, will Putin meet him halfway? If he does, will he mean what he says? Or will it be some kind of trick? I was going to talk a little bit about Putin and Trump. I don't think I have to talk about Trump. We've all been witnesses to what's been going on. I will just read very quickly 2 excerpts from Putin's autobiography. It's not so much all written by him, it's based on interviews with him by Russian journalists, and it includes some of his own words. And you get a sense of him from these two quotes. One, he's talking about the impoverished, rundown apartment house he lived in Leningrad. There, on that stair landing outside his apartment, I got a quick and lasting lesson in the meaning of the word cornered. There were hordes of rats in the front entryway. My friends and I used to chase them around with sticks. Once I spotted a huge rat and pursued it down the hall until it drove me into a corner. It had nowhere to run. Suddenly it lashed around and threw itself at me. I was surprised and frightened. Now the rat was chasing me. It jumped across the landing and down the stairs. Luckily, I was a little faster, and I managed to slam the door shut on its nose. And this is a quote from Putin's elementary school teacher. She said to these reporters, "I think Volodya," that's Vladimir Putin's Russian nickname, "is a good person, but he never forgives people who betray him or are mean to him. In any case, that's what I think." Now, my final overarching question that I'd like to end with, if I'm right, that many of the things the United States has done over these years has alienated and antagonized Russia and Putin, let's play a game of imagining that the United States doesn't do that. Let's imagine that NATO does not expand, that the Iraq war does not occur, that the Libyan UN resolution is not violated, and that we don't cheer on the color revolutions in Ukraine and Georgia. Would that mean that Russia would be getting along with us now much better? Or would someone like Putin still find reason to be aggrieved? Is there, in other words, something about Russia and its penchant for authoritarianism and anti-Westernism that would lead it to be aggrieved almost no matter what we did? And on the other side, is there something about us? Something about us which leads us to do what we do that antagonizes and alienates Russia, and that it may be a fantasy to imagine that we could stop doing that. Anyway, I'm going to stop there. I hope I've left time for questions, comments, counter-arguments, whatever you like. Miriam, is it Miriam? Has a microphone which she's going to try to bring around. Now, I'll stay up here unless I can't hear, which is quite possible since I'm hard of hearing.
First of all, thank you for your thoughtful discourse. One of the things that has been, I think, a problem for Putin and for the Russians in general has been the fluctuating energy market, oil, natural gas, and particularly with the shift in Europe toward solar, wind, and other non-carbon-based energy sources. That puts a threat to some of Russia's economic stability. They've certainly found their ways to make money in all kinds of other ways. But one of the concerns that I have is that that could actually make Putin more desperate as he tries to shore up his financial base and to keep power by keeping the other oligarchs happy.
Yes, this is quite true. I mean, it's already happened as a result of the drastic fall in oil and gas prices, and the sanctions that the West laid on after the annexation of Crimea and the intervention in Ukraine. That's part of the picture that has made Putin so upset and angry. I just want to add one other thing to that I left out. I had it in my notes. The hacking itself is almost certainly, in Putin's eyes, equal to what he sees as our attempts to interfere in Russian elections. What does he have in mind? I don't think we hacked their elections. I don't know. What we did do, though, was send over lots of specialists in democracy. The National Republican and Democratic parties in this country each has an international institute which sent over people to help teach the Russians how to campaign, how to run an election, We did this in great numbers, along with other NGOs, and Putin obviously believes that this was interfering in their internal affairs. That's one of the reasons why he has now banished them, or actually what he did, very ominous, was he decided that to rule, or he got the parliament to rule, that any Russian non-governmental organization that collects, that receives money from a foreign country must declare itself to be a foreign agent. And what's so ominous about that is that that phrase, foreign agent, was used in the 1930s by Stalin and others to designate those whose time on earth was not going to be very long. So that's a bit of a roundabout answer, but I think it takes off from your question. Yes?
Which one?
There seems to be a current theory that some of the hacking was in response to a sense of personal animus on the part of Putin and Hillary Clinton when she served as Secretary of State. Do you find any credibility in that theory?
Again, I speak without direct evidence, but it certainly has the ring of truth to it. We know that Hillary Clinton condemned the very elections that thousands of Russians demonstrated against to protest, and Putin thereafter said that she was behind those demonstrations. That was probably a little bit of exaggeration. We know she wasn't. Hundreds of thousands of Russians didn't come out because she said the elections were falsified in part. They came out because their neighbors and friends could see it happening. But it has the ring of truth because, well, partly because of what the elementary school teacher said. You know, he doesn't like that kind of behavior. It's a kind of betrayal. And it's a short step given the practices of the Russian secret police from whose organization he emerged to take the actions that they took. And they could have larger political purposes, but they could also have that personal animus toward her. I think I've been reading today's paper or reading online that the latest leaks which have been coming out from supposedly well-informed sources say that our intelligence people concluded that the hacking that went on was both pro-Trump and anti-Hillary. Yes.
My recollection, which was a little fuzzy and may be incorrect, is that George F. Kennan.
Just point it towards you.
Is that George F. Kennan was not only against the expansion of NATO, but he was against NATO from the very outset. So NATO clearly, and from your hypothetical also, was a big factor in each of the Cold Wars, if we're now in a second Cold War. Do you think a possible deal-making for elimination or at least cooling of the Cold War would be some kind of deal involving a reduction, not a dismantling, but a reduction in NATO in some way, and the role of the U.S. in NATO?
You know, I didn't mean to say that expanding NATO was totally wrong. It's not that hard to understand the logic of people like Bush at the time, 1990, 91, and later Clinton, those who expanded it. After all, NATO was a going concern. It had worked. What was the alternative? Was the alternative somehow an all pan-European organization, including everybody, including Russia, which would have been bigger than anybody and potentially disruptive? Was the alternative to, say, limit the expansion of NATO to the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary? Well, if you did that, that's like saying, those are the ones we'll protect, but these other guys, we won't. That's an invitation to Russia at some point to make trouble. The one thing I feel very strongly about was that the invitation to Ukraine and Georgia was a big mistake. I mean, Baltics, well, we could argue about that. But Ukraine was the biggest non-Russian part of the Russian Empire. Many of the Russians won't even admit that Ukraine is a separate country. They say it and Russia go back to Kievan Rus, which was the founder of both. And I know that when the National Security Council under George W. Bush considered the expansion of NATO into Ukraine and Georgia, Condi Rice, the Secretary of State, is supposed to have presented the pros and cons, but not taken a position. I suspect Dick Cheney, without knowing it, I suspect that he did take a position. It was bring him on, bring him in. And Bush is quoted as saying, well, if they ask Ukraine and Georgia, I can't say no. So this whole question of which ones you accept, if any, what was the alternative to accepting none of them, is kind of complicated, except, I think, for Ukraine and Georgia, which was a step too far. The kind of deal that I alluded to at the beginning, which I can imagine now, probably will not begin with NATO. What I imagine, and here, if anybody in the audience is from the government or been in the government and know, you may very well know more than I do, but what I imagine is that the U.S. and the West could de facto accept the annexation of Crimea because they're not going to give it back. And if they're not going to give it back, then if we continue making a stink about it and imposing sanctions as a result of it, it just makes things worse. And we could conceivably begin to lift some of the sanctions if the Russians pulled out of Ukraine and pulled back from the borders of the Baltic states where they've been conducting military exercises, and they stopped the dangerous overflights right up to the edge of NATO countries. And one other thing, this is not part of a deal, but just part of what's going on and what could be stopped. Have you noticed the way there's practically no American congressman or senator who doesn't preface Putin's name when he or she utters it with the words murderer and thug? Well, he's not a good man. He's probably even an evil man. He's killed, or his people have killed a lot of people, but you can't have a relationship with a country in which you refer to its leader constantly as a murderer and a thug.
Yes, just a commentary. In 1994, the Budapest Memorandum guaranteed to Ukraine its territorial integrity in exchange for giving up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. United States, Great Britain, Russia, and Ukraine were parties to this agreement. The guarantee was that the territorial integrity would remain. In 2014, this did not happen. There was the takeover of Crimea during a period of weakness of the transition of government in Ukraine, and there was specific intention by Russian intelligence to infiltrate the Donbass and to create the revolution that we see today. What went wrong? What went wrong? Why did the United States and Great Britain not defend the piece of paper that they had been written on? And what would have happened had Ukraine not given up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world for this piece of paper?
That's a very good point. The Budapest Agreement of 1994 did indeed stipulate exactly what this gentleman just said. This is the kind of thing that led me at the time they seized Crimea and moved into Ukraine. We had one of these events, a 5-college event, for students and faculty. And I went down the list. I had a speech of Putin's in which he attacked us for doing this, and this, and justified his own actions in that way. And I said, I think he's right about many of the things that he says we did. But that's no excuse for action that tears up one of the fundamental pillars of the post-World War II international order by moving across a border. But, if the only way to stop it was an actual conflict, and you may say there were other ways to stop it, then I'm afraid Russia had a bigger stake than we did in that area. Our stake was precisely the one you speak of, and it's a very important stake. But there's Ukraine on their borders. There are their troops on their borders. In any war, if it ever had come to that, they would have been able to escalate and at any stage well, I mean, one hesitates to imagine what goes on in a war between the U.S. and Russia today. But I think there was a kind of discretion is the unfortunate, sad, better part of valor, not to defend what was the correct cause if, by defending it, we risked actual conflict and war.
Hello? Even though there are protests, I'm back here, against Putin in Russia right now, I believe that he's very popular with his own people for the most part, and it looks as though he's going to be the leader for some long time. And my question is, do you agree with that? Do you foresee any ways in which that connection that he has with his people might change?
You're quite right that Putin is extremely popular with his own people. His favorability rating has been as high as 82%. Compared that to Trump's 36%. And in other words, the Russian people generally approve of what he's doing. They began to get uneasy when the economic situation began to crater. But then he was very clever. He's a very shrewd guy. And the annexation of Crimea and the war in Ukraine and the intervention in Syria, all publicized nonstop in a one-sided way on Russian television, revived his popularity again. He's almost certainly going to run again in 2018, which is really incredible because when he serves out a 6-year term beginning in 2018, he will have been, if he does, 24 years the leader of Russia, 25 if you count the acting presidency of 1999, and that's about as long as Stalin, 1929 to 1953. Now, one may ask, who is likely to replace him and how? One of the things that Putin does is he cuts off at the knees anybody else who might become a pretender, a contender. One can imagine a peaceful transfer of power within his own circle in which not Medvedev, because Medvedev has now been discredited by revelations of corruption, but there's a man who is the defense minister. I don't know if anybody's heard his name. His name is Sergei Shoigu. He's not even Russian. I think he's a Tatar. But the people one talks to say that he is the kind of guy Putin might trust with taking over after him. One other thing is that Putin's people say, and some Russians who are not his people find plausible, the argument that given the extremes in Russia and the irrationality of both extremes, Russia may be more stable under Putin than without him. Now, they use this as propaganda, keep us in power because I'm better than the alternative. But people I know who are not Putin people take this seriously as a question needing to be pondered.
Sir, do you have a question?
I know we're going over the limit. We're about at the limit, but may we continue for a while? Yeah, absolutely. Anybody who wants to,
well, just a
to do so, and we can continue. If not, we can continue for a while at least. Who's got the mic?
right here. So, in terms of U.S. foreign policy and the likelihood that Putin outlasts the next, 2 presidents, maybe in the U.S., is there anything more than a tactical strategy? I mean, tactical thinking versus strategic thinking that could possibly go on?
I'm not sure that there is. Even in the Soviet period, when we were very pessimistic about what could be done, and we assumed that the Soviet Union might last forever, only to be shocked and pleasantly surprised when it disappeared, there were still people who thought that through exchange programs, through exposing Soviets who lived for a long time behind an Iron Curtain to the reality of life in the West, we could sort of change or affect the attitudes of people and maybe bring about a change in the long run. At the moment, the kind of anti-Americanism that one sees on the part of a lot of Russians offers less opportunity for that kind of approach. I think the hope is if you look forward to a day without Putin, when the country continues or goes back to building the democracy that Gorbachev started, the hope is that the middle class is expanding. It's now estimated that about 25% of the Russian population is living pretty darn well, not very well, but well. And they want to travel. Putin is shrewd. He allows them to travel. They want to read books. He allows them to read books. He even allows at least one newspaper, which happens to be co-owned by Gorbachev and an oligarch, called Novaya Gazeta, which does tell the truth. And he allows one radio station called Echo Moskvy, which tells it like it is. So he's shrewd in those ways. But I guess the hope would be that this burgeoning middle class, which wants really unrigged elections, as they showed when they went out to protest, will get bigger and bigger. At the moment, they're primarily in Moscow and Petersburg, but there's some of them in other big cities. In the long run, they may bring about change. But I think if and when they do, they will bring it about themselves. And it's not we who will do it for them, because we're probably no better equipped to build a democratic nation in Russia than we were in Iraq.
This may be a naive reading of things, and I'd hope that you'd point that out. But I'd like to tease two threads from what you've been talking about and see how they relate. One is the idea, that's a popular idea, that there's some continuity in the character of the Russian state over the decades, that from the Tsarist to the communist to Putin, you've got authoritarianism, you've got the relation of the other cities and provinces to Moscow, you've got the state control of religion, depending on what the state religion is. So that's one thread, is the idea that they just change the patches, combined with the asymmetry of tools used between the U.S. and Russia to achieve their goals. That is, the Russians were, of course, famous for the great game in Afghanistan with Britain, and then popularly, and I think particularly in the book Legacy of Ashes about the CIA, they were much better at the spy game than we were. They managed to put spies among us, and we generally, when we tried to do that, they got rolled up and turned immediately. However, the U.S. has an economic power, an optimistic power, sort of a brash story it tells. So my question is, given these two threads, the asymmetric tools that each country has and the perception of Russia as sort of being constant, if you were to wipe away all this history and start from year one and let each country be itself, so to speak, would they inevitably still come into conflict in the areas where they touch just because of the very separate tools and characters available to the respective states?
So you want to wipe away the history which makes Russia what it is?
No, the relations between the two. If all the bad blood were erased tomorrow,
yeah,
but you still had the countries being where they are and still had their respective interests and tools, would they invariably come back into conflict in the same way?
That's sort of what I was asking at the end of my talk when I said, let's imagine that the United States doesn't do any of the things that drive Putin crazy. Would Russia, under him or somebody like him, nonetheless, because of its history, because of its penchant, its tendency toward authoritarianism and anti-Westernism, would it nonetheless feel aggrieved and a rival, and we'd end up in trouble? And I don't really know the answer. I think that is, in a way, the big question.
I think, based on what I know of Russian tourists, the answer is probably yes.
Based on what you know of Russian tourists?
Yes.
Where, in this country?
Around the world.
Oh. Well, you care to say a word about Russian tourists? No, we'll.
My impression is they bring the little rain cloud with them.
Oh.
So I'd like
we
to.
need to talk more about that later. Yes.
I'd like to ask you to speculate. Assume for the moment that evidence comes forward establishing without a doubt that the Russians hacked the election and changed the outcome of the election. Let's assume for the moment that Trump is no longer president and Pence is, and that there's strong anti-Russian attitude developing in the United States. How would the Russians react to this, or how would Putin react to such a course of events? A lot of speculation there.
Well, it would be nice if he felt guilty, as if he had contributed to an outcome that he doesn't like. Probably wouldn't happen. I think from their point of view, Pence will be much more difficult than Trump might have been if Trump felt free to do what he wanted to do, which he may no longer feel free to do. I guess that's my reaction.
Can you
Amplify that? In what way?
The global generality was too great for me.
Okay, well then we have to go back to the question. Can you ask your question again, and I'll try to be more specific? Yeah, I was responding to you, right?
I'm interested in an outcome in which, number one, the facts are established without question that the Russians hacked the election, and there is a vehement outcry of anger toward the Russians. And at the same time, Pence replaces our current president.
I think that's going to be worse. The situation is going to be worse than it is now.
And then how would the Russians?
How will they react?
To this?
Well, I think they will probably continue with business as usual. That is, they won't. I think they hope for some kind of deal with Trump of the kind that I began to imagine. I think they won't get that deal from Pence. So they will be back in dealing with a situation where they don't see much give, if any, in our position, and we don't see much in theirs. I think we will have a kind of status quo, sort of frozen Cold War, which is redundant, I realize, between the two of us until the leadership changes again with a Democrat coming in. Now, will a Democrat be more likely to make a deal with the Russians? Probably not. So, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is that if it's established that they did the hacking and Trump is driven out of power for the foreseeable future, any Republican and any Democrat will be reluctant to try to make the concessions which might ease the new Cold War. And if that's the case, it will be fought in the way it's been fought until maybe Putin is gone, but then it depends on who replaces him.
I'd like to go back before that happens, because it hasn't happened and we don't know how long it's going to take. So if Trump has enough time to do something that he wants to do vis-a-vis Russia, what will that be? I appreciate that what you talked about was the norms in Russian thought, which were very helpful to me without Trump. But a lot of things that Trump wants to do would not drive the Russians crazy.
Well, Trump obviously wants trade with the Russians. He wants cooperation against terrorism. He seems to think that there are ways in which we could cooperate much more than we have, although in a place like Syria, that hasn't happened yet, although despite the efforts of John Kerry and perhaps Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. I already mentioned what I imagine. I imagine Trump might say, we're not going to get Crimea back, so let's stop giving them a hard time about that. And we'd like them to get out of Ukraine, so let's offer to lift sanctions gradually as they leave Ukraine. That's what I imagine, a deal like that, plus an effort to cooperate against terrorism, plus an expansion of trade. Do you have something else in mind?
No, yeah. I just don't. I wanted to make sure I had it all. Yeah.
That's maybe one more, or at most two.
Yeah, I was thinking about this idea of deal, and I've sort of thought of this before. One idea I was thinking is maybe you could call for an internationally monitored referendum in Crimea so that people could actually vote themselves whether they want to be in Russia and say, okay, if they want to be in Russia, okay, fine. And then also on the Ukrainian part, you could say, okay, once you have a Ukraine that's sort of shorn of such territorial, ethnic disputes with Russia, then that would actually be a much stronger NATO candidate. And you could bring Ukraine into NATO and be sort of a counter-move response that you could say to Putin, okay, well, okay, you get Crimea, but we're going to have a response to this. If this is the way you're going to play, we're going to have a certain security architecture here to sort of stand against any further moves like this.
I like the idea of an international supervised referendum in Crimea, although I am pretty sure it would vote to stay in Russia.
Well, that's the whole point.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
It would
Right.
Give a.
But as for a Ukraine free of Russian semi-occupation, joining NATO, I don't think Russia is going to allow that anyway, no how. That's why they're there. I think you're more likely to get the Russians to move out if you lead them to understand, either explicitly or implicitly, that we will not favor Ukrainian membership in NATO. Which brings us back to that issue I described at the beginning, where if they want to join it and their people want to join it, who are we to say they can't, because the Russians won't like that? That sounds terrible. But it may be that for the sake of peace in that region, that's what we should do. I should mention that Robert Gates, the former Secretary of Defense and head of the CIA, was here last year and gave a talk, and Biddy Martin had a dinner which Jane and I were fortunate enough to be invited to, and I asked him about this, and he said essentially that let's agree that Ukraine will not join NATO, and then the Russians might be willing to get out. Even if that happened, if Ukraine were free to be what it wants to be, the Russians wouldn't like it. And if Ukraine were proved better able than it has been so far, it's not been very successful so far, in building a functioning democracy and an economy that works, then the Russians would feel threatened that would promote a change in Russia, which at least Putin doesn't want. That is a color revolution. So I could imagine Putin, I suppose, even refusing to get out if he were assured that Ukraine wouldn't be a member of NATO. But once again, imagine that assurance. It sounds like Yalta. It sounds like a spheres of influence deal between Stalin and Churchill, where we give 50% control of Greece to them and 70% of Romania. That kind of stuff makes a lot of sense, but it doesn't work very well in the world. A lot of people don't like it, rightly so. Betsy, what should we do?
Isn't the next step for NATO Moldavia? It's a tiny country, but it may get very interesting.
Yes, the question isn't the next step for NATO Moldavia? Actually, it's now called, I think, Moldova, but it's the same place. One reason it can't happen is that under the rules of NATO admission of new members, there has to be stability and no territory which is the subject of dispute. But it is in Moldavia. The Russian troops occupy what's called Transnistria. That's, by the way, one reason why the Russians may stay in Ukraine, because as long as Ukraine's eastern region is up for dispute, then according to NATO's own rules, it can't admit Ukraine. And that's one reason why the Russians are in Georgia, in the areas of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, where they have occupation forces, because as long as that's the case, under NATO's own rules, they can't be admitted to NATO. The phrase for this, the cliche is, these are frozen conflicts, which have the effect of giving Russia the outcome it wants.